When Russia launched its supposed special military operation in February 2022, there was a worldwide belief that Ukraine would fall within days or a few weeks. Russia, with supposedly the world's second most powerful military, was poised to steamroll through Ukrainian defenses and capture Kyiv before the West could even react, making it one of the most effective campaigns in recent history. 3.5 years later, the prediction looks like one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in modern military history. It's not because analysts got the timeline wrong, but because they fundamentally misunderstood what they were looking at. Russia wasn't launching a calculated military operation, it was committing a strategic suicide. The truth is that Russia's failure to make progress in Ukraine was practically inevitable. Every single aspect of Russian President Vladimir Putin's war plan was born from imagined assumptions, starting with Ukrainian resistance and ending with the rigid Soviet-era military doctrine that proved catastrophically unsuited for modern warfare. The warning signs were there from day one for anyone willing to look past the propaganda and examine the systemic weakness that have plagued the Russian military operations for over a century. Let's dissect exactly why Russia was destined to fail from the moment that Putin gave the order to attack. According to research by the think tank RUSI, when Putin announced his invasion, he expected to take control of Ukraine within 10 days. But even that timeline was optimistic compared to what Russian planners actually believed would happen. The fundamental flaw in Russia's strategy was both tactical and psychological in nature. Putin's assessment of Ukraine was so wrong for two main reasons. First, Putin truly believed Ukraine wasn't legitimate or independent without Russia. This was broadcast in his famous essay on the historical unity of Ukrainians and Russians, which came out in July 2021, practically heralding the invasion. But perhaps more importantly, for the past 20 years, Putin has done his best to dismantle any dissenting opinions from both his inner circle and his government. As such, he is basically surrounded by people who either have the same ideological view as him or are so afraid of contradicting him that they don't show it. So instead of a conventional invasion led by the entire military forces Russia could muster on its western flank, Putin planned for what he termed a special military operation, led by the Russian security services or the FSB. To avoid sanctions by the West, the plan was to complete the operation as quickly as possible, using infiltrated groups to neutralize Ukrainian political leadership. The consequences of this decision could be seen almost immediately. As soon as Russian forces entered Ukraine, Moscow sent out parade uniforms packed for victory celebrations. But what didn't make it into the country was spare parts for equipment to maintain extended combat operations. Even more damning, captured maps from Russian mid-level commanders did not contain orders to attack. Instead, there were dubious orders to march in and disregard the threat of encountering the enemy. It was essentially wishful thinking that Russia could just waltz into Ukraine, as if it were just a regular day, topple the government, and install a puppet regime loyal to Putin. When reality eventually and inevitably hit, Russia didn't have any contingency plans. The issue with the special service making the plan and not the military is that you actually miss a lot of the key professional military interjectors needed to make a coherent military plan. The clearest example of Russia's doomed strategy could be seen at the very beginning of the invasion through the assault on Hostomel Airport, just 12 miles from Kyiv. This operation was supposed to be Russia's masterstroke and an entry into Ukraine. It involved seizing the airport, which was considered one of the largest and best equipped in the world due to being the home base of the largest plane, the Antonov AN-225, and then holding it under Russia's control. Immediately after occupying it, Russia could airdrop reinforcements directly into Ukraine's capital. From the airport, it would be a fairly straightforward route to Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital. But instead of that happening, it became what security analyst Andrew McGregor called the Russian airborne disaster. The plan itself was strategically sound, at least on paper. The Russian military selected Hostomel not only due to its large runway, but also its location along the Russian military's mechanized forces' route of advance. This meant that any ground forces coming from Belarus, which they did, would naturally join up with the occupying forces at the airport to completely prevent Ukraine from reclaiming it. The airport itself had favorable defendable terrain around the airfield and likely had lighter defenses than other nearby airfields due to primarily being a civilian cargo airport. This meant a small strike force could seize and hold the airfield long enough for reinforcements to arrive by air or ground. But the execution revealed fatal flaws in Russian intelligence and planning. Russia's advance units numbered between 200 and 300 so-called elite soldiers, transported from Belarus to Hostomel via a dozen helicopters, and despite technically managing to get to the airport in one piece, which was an accomplishment given that they were discovered a few dozen miles out, Ukraine was practically ready for this kind of strike. Around 200 conscripts from the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade were based around the airfield and had established defensive positions around the airport, armed only with small arms, Soviet-era anti-aircraft missiles and anti-tank weapons. When Russian transport helicopters attempted to land paratroopers, they were met with intense small arms fire from Ukrainian positions. forcing them to circle the airport and land in the surrounding field and near residential buildings. Ukrainian defenders armed with Igla man-portable air defense weapons also managed to shoot down 4 Ka-52 helicopters and an Mi-28, significantly disrupting the Russian assault and giving a much-needed morale boost to the defenders. Even more importantly, Ukraine had already filled the airstrip with vehicles and downed aircraft, preventing anything from landing on it. This made the airport essentially useless for its intended purpose. Ukraine had also called in support from neighboring villages, which would be en route over the next few hours, so the defenses on site would actually have something to look forward to. And then Russia basically abandoned its plan after discovering that it might not work. By some accounts, Russian aircraft were spotted moving from Pskov, roughly 2 hours away from Kyiv. This force numbered at least 1,000 troops, but could have been as many as 4,000, having been loaded onto 18 Il-76 transport planes earlier in the day. However, none of the reinforcements would show up at the airport, having been rerouted back to Russia or Belarus when the initial occupation started taking too long. While the airport was eventually occupied, technically speaking, it took well into the afternoon, at which point the incoming Russian forces from Belarus were delayed to the north, having encountered local defenses themselves. Simultaneously, the mechanized infantry from Ukraine arrived at the airport and, seeing that it was at least nominally under Russian control, rained artillery strikes onto it, further damaging the airfield. By nightfall, Hostomel was practically useless as an operational air bridge for Russia's assault on Kyiv. The collapse of this plan then forced Russian forces into a prolonged and costly ground offensive. The human cost was staggering. The Kyiv Post reported that about 500 Russian troops were killed in the battle overall, including the second wave that came with the mechanized infantry. And this will be only the first of many days with triple-digit casualty counts for Russia. More importantly, the failure at Hostomel shattered Russia's entire strategic concept for the war. Without the ability to airlift massive reinforcements directly into Ukraine's heartlands, Russia was forced into exactly the kind of prolonged ground campaign it was unprepared to fight. You could argue that this failure to create novel tactics is deeply rooted in Russia's military doctrine itself. Russia's military suffers from a generational issue caused by its Soviet roots, combined with a deep resistance to adapting the doctrine to modern times and equipment capabilities. Unlike NATO forces, which institutionalize battlefield lessons, Russia defaults to predetermined scenarios in attritional warfare, recycling past models and relying on predictable mass mobilization over maneuver. This isn't just about equipment or training, but rather how Russia thinks about war itself. There's chronic underdevelopment of Russia's non-commissioned officer corps, NCOs, which is ordinarily a crucial pillar of modern military leadership, creating a string of weak links between the higher-level officers creating tactics and the troops on the front fulfilling them. Unlike Western forces where NCOs enable decentralized battlefield initiative, Russia's rigid top-down command structure leaves lower-level officers unable to make autonomous tactical decisions. This makes Russian operations inflexible by default, which means that once things start to go wrong, Russian tactics have no way to compensate for sudden changes. The historical roots of this inability to adapt stem from a time even before the Soviet era. Famed Russian historian Vasily Kluchevsky wrote about Ivan IV's reign. The people had no right to a will of their own, but were obliged to think in accordance with the will of the authorities that represented them. This authoritarian mindset, refined through centuries of Tsarist and Soviet rule, created a military culture fundamentally incompatible with modern warfare. And Russia has been paying the price for the consequences of that. It's undeniable that a part of its lack of progress has been due to poor leadership within the army and a highly centralized Russian command and control structure. When Russian units encountered unexpected resistance or rapidly changing battlefield conditions, they simply couldn't adapt. This was in stark contrast with Ukraine's military, which had been training alongside NATO troops since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. This gave Ukraine several years of experience working with some of the most experienced teams, particularly in terms of adapting and performing small-scale operations. A part of that failure to adapt also comes from Russian military doctrine not changing since Soviet times in terms of imagining battlefield scenarios. This is outlined in a report published by the French Institute of International Relations, or IFRI, which suggests that Russian military doctrine is primarily focused on an all-out war against NATO. This long-held belief that NATO would encroach upon and attack Russia didn't seem to change, even when Russia and NATO ostensibly started to have more positive outlooks on global geopolitics and bilateral relations. In IFRI's report, one of the key faults of Russian doctrine is that it assumes that Russia would have the terrain advantage in a defensive war. This would allow Russia to deploy its air forces to serve as vital surveillance and denial platforms against an enemy that would be trying to exert air superiority. Russia's numerous air forces would be used to conduct precision airstrikes supported by mechanized infantry and anti-air defenses. What happened instead in Ukraine was a complete degradation of that belief. Not only did Russia mount an offensive war, but it did so without managing to secure air superiority over Ukraine. The layered defenses provided by Ukraine and institutional failures meant that most of Russia's air force would end up being underutilized. This further reduced the effectiveness of Russia's long-range strikes and even land offensives, as a lack of proper air support was something that Russia didn't seem to be able to conceive. Of course, while the broad strokes of Russian doctrine could somewhat explain why Russia failed to utilize its numerical advantage, its intelligence services, or lack thereof, can be considered the main catalyst behind the invasion in the first place. In short, Russia's intelligence services were feeding Putin comfortable lies about Ukrainian weakness. At the same time, Western intelligence services were already cognizant of Russian intentions and capabilities. Even months before the invasion, US and British intelligence agencies and diplomats publicly detailed what they said were Kremlin plans for the invasion. In November 2021, CIA Director William Burns traveled to Moscow to directly warn Russian officials against invading. Then in mid-January 2022, Burns visited Kyiv to personally brief Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on US intelligence assessments of Russia's imminent invasion. These same plans were reiterated by the then President Joe Biden himself. This intelligence sharing gave Ukraine a crucial advantage that Russian planners never anticipated. Ukraine knew exactly what Russia was planning, including the critical assault on Hostomel Airport. Ukrainian forces were preparing and waiting, especially given that the attack on Hostomel was something Ukraine had been privy to in a way through the annexation of Crimea, which happened in the same manner. Meanwhile, Russian intelligence was providing assessments that were practically flights of fancy. Although some of the data gathered by the FSB seemed to support open source studies, the amount and kind of data gathered, or at least used, to inform Putin's decision were carefully filtered to create a picture that supported Putin's belief, namely that he was pushing on an open door in Ukraine. The result was predictable. Despite Putin's penchant for secrecy, he would have been far better served had he just Googled Ukrainian attitudes toward Russia and read the results of publicly available opinion polling. Perhaps nowhere is Russia's strategic failure more apparent than in its catastrophically slow adaptation to drone warfare, which would become the defining technology of 21st century conflict over the course of the very war it started. While Ukraine rapidly embraced and innovated with drone technology, Russia remained locked in Cold War thinking about massive conventional platforms. The evidence of this failure is documented in excruciating detail by organizations like Oryx that tracked confirmed equipment losses. By mid-2025, Russia will have lost at least 4,000 tanks, with the actual number likely being much higher. The total losses of armored vehicles are at 13,000 by the same count, which is more than what most countries have at their disposal. These numbers represent how Russia's conventional military power faltered against an opponent that was initially dismissed as militarily irrelevant. One of the key breakthroughs Ukraine had was the complete open sourcing of its drone technology development. Drone manufacturing and prototyping were done by volunteer crews in garages and homemade studios, which were then directly funded by the Ukrainian government to spearhead research and development. Then various teams could share their progress to further speed up development. This resulted in Ukraine streamlining the process from idea to prototype to usable equipment within months, rather than the years it takes for traditional military procurement. And even then, Russia's supposed modernization proved to be largely cosmetic. For example, Russia's newest tank, the T-14 Armata, has been showcased extensively in parades and has made practically negligible appearances on the actual battlefield. This goes hand in hand with Russia severely overestimating its procurement capacities, as the Armata went from being bought by the thousands to only 20 being built by the time the invasion started. And when Russia did finally attempt to deploy its showcase equipment, the results were embarrassing. The T-14 Armata tanks were brought to the front line in Ukraine and unceremoniously pulled back within weeks. Russia's failures also extended beyond land combat to a domain where it should have held unquestioned superiority, the Black Sea. With Ukraine possessing virtually no navy at the start of the war, Russia's Black Sea fleet should have established complete maritime dominance within days. Instead, Ukraine revolutionized naval warfare and systematically demolished Russian naval power, using nothing but ingenuity and Western-supplied technology. By mid-2025, Ukraine will have destroyed or disabled roughly 40% of Russia's Black Sea fleet, forcing the remainder to flee to ports where they're essentially useless and even target practice for evolving long-range drones. The symbolic low point came with the destruction of Russia's Black Sea flagship, the Moskva. This was the defining moment when the world realized Russia's navy wasn't invincible. Ukraine's development of naval drones, and more specifically, drones that were entirely deployed in water, was heralded as one of the quickest military innovations in modern history that led to practical and devastating applications. The strategic consequences were devastating for Russia, but they were eclipsed by the economic benefits Ukraine could reap. By forcing Russian ships away from Ukrainian shipping lanes, naval drones didn't just win tactical victories, they secured Ukraine's economic survival. Ukraine's grain exports alone represent almost $10 billion in revenue that funds its war effort. What makes Russia's failure in Ukraine so comprehensive is that it represents not just tactical defeats, but the collapse of an entire military-political system that was never designed for the kind of war it attempted to fight. Russia came into the war believing that the Ukrainian government would retreat or be betrayed by its own population, that Russian troops would be welcomed as liberators. When those assumptions proved false, Russia had no real alternatives. Russian military forces have failed to significantly advance on the battlefield, seized limited territory, lost substantial quantities of equipment relative to Ukraine, and suffered remarkably high rates of fatalities and casualties. The human cost has been staggering. Over 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed and wounded since the war began. Russia's daily average of casualties has increased practically month over month since 2022. Putting things into perspective, Russia has suffered roughly 5 times as many fatalities in Ukraine as in all other Russian and Soviet wars since the end of World War II. Perhaps most telling is the rate of territorial gains relative to the enormous costs. After 3.5 years of fighting, Russia controls approximately 20% of Ukrainian territory, and much of that was seized in 2014, 8 years before the current invasion. The 2022-2025 phase of the war has seen Russia make minimal territorial gains at enormous cost. Forbes did some independent number crunching using statistics from April 2025, where Russia only took around 68 square miles of territory. If Ukraine maintains that level of defense and Russia doesn't step up the offensive, the war in Ukraine would take another 230 years. In the end, Russia's defeat in Ukraine wasn't simply the result of bad luck, poor leadership, or temporary setbacks. It was the combination of these systemic failures that have plagued Russian military culture for decades, which finally came to a head when Russia was actually forced to deploy its forces en masse against an opponent who had Western backing. Every aspect of Russia's approach, from the fantasy-level planning assumptions to the rigid command structure, from the intelligence failures to the technological backwardness, created conditions that made failure inevitable. The tragedy is that these weaknesses were visible long before the war started, as US intelligence was clearly already notified that the conflict would escalate to an invasion. The lesson for the future is clear. Military power in the 21st century doesn't come from the size of armies or the supposed sophistication of equipment. It comes from the ability to adapt, innovate, and learn, as well as the ability to band together with powerful allies. These are all capabilities that authoritarian systems systematically suppress or avoid precisely because they are antithetical to authoritarian rule. Thanks for watching, and to understand how Ukraine's innovative defense strategies have revolutionized modern warfare, check out our analysis of the Kharkiv counteroffensive. And to stay up to date with the evolution of military strategy in the 21st century, subscribe to The Military Show for comprehensive analyses of global conflicts.